Yeah, he's way off with 70.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Empathy Delusion seminar. I hope webinar. I hope everyone is well and healthy and having a good day. I'd just like to introduce myself before we get going. My name's Andrew Tenzer. I am Director of Group Insight at Reach. For those of you who don't know Reach, we're the largest commercial news publisher in the UK. So we reach 47 million UK adults every month across our portfolio. We own a number of national news brands which range across the political spectrum, including the Mirror and the Daily Express. We also own a number of iconic regional titles such as the Manchester Evening News, the Liverpool Echo, and many, many more. Ian?
Hi everyone, as the slide says, my name's Ian Murray. I'm the co-founder of House 51. House 51 is a behavioural insights and research agency that specialises in doing work in primarily the media, marketing and advertising industries. We're based in the UK, but we work internationally with a wide range of well-known names that you'll have heard of.
Great. So, what will we be covering today? Well, essentially, the Empathy Delusion, as some of you will know, was published in July 2019. I think it's fair to say it got pretty much the whole industry talking, and it's been cited in a number of people's work since, and was actually heavily referenced in Lemon by Orlando Wood, which you might be familiar with, which I believe is the highest selling book the IPA has ever published. And actually, before we get to the main study, we wanted to give you some context to how we actually landed on empathy. So Ian, firstly, will be taking you through the main highlights of the precursor, which was Gut Instinct, which we published back in 2018. Then I'll be taking you through the Empathy Delusion and what this means for marketing and advertising. And finally, we're going to take a look at some brand new data on our values and morals during the current crisis. So we've got some updated data to share with you. So now I'm just going to hand over to Ian, who is going to take you through the first section, which is Gut Instinct. Ian, over to you.
Okay, everyone, can you see me, I hope? So, as Andrew said, what I'm going to do for the first part of the presentation is cover some of the background, the thinking and the research that led up to the empathy delusion. Now, Andrew and I have been working on these various strands of research for probably 2 or 3 years now, and I think it's fair to say that there's one overarching theme that kind of informs all of the work that we've done so far, and that is that essentially marketing is an elitist industry. And what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that the people who work in marketing tend to have distinct economic, cultural, educational experiences that diverge to quite a significant degree to the experiences of the mainstream audience that they're trying to engage. But rather than just simply take our word for that and as assert that, what I'd like to do for the first few minutes of the presentation is consider 1 or 2 questions that reinforce what some of these differences might be. And I'd like you just to think about your answers to these questions as I go through them. So the first one here, thinking back to when you were aged 14, what was the job or occupation of the chief income earner in your household? Now, this is a question and the data associated with the question that is widely available in the UK from the government's Office of National Statistics. And it's a question that features prominently in a large-scale and long-running longitudinal study called the Labour Force Survey. And obviously, clearly, what this question is actually getting at is essentially what are the class origins of the workforce in the UK? Essentially, at a very colloquial level, what we're talking about is, did you grow up in a working class household? Did you grow up in a middle class household? Or did you grow up in what might be, for want of a better term, called an upper class household? Now, recently, in January 2020, a group of academics at the London School of Economics have published a very interesting book called The Class Ceiling. And what they've done with the class ceiling is they've used the data from the Labour Force Survey to explore the extent to which professions in the United Kingdom are open to people from diverse social economic backgrounds. So again, what we're really thinking about here is social mobility and the access that people from different backgrounds have to professions in the UK. And what we've done is we've extracted a key chart from the book, and that's on the right-hand side. And I think what you'll see very clearly when we look at this chart is our assertion that marketing is an elite industry is borne out by this longitudinal government-based data from the Labour Force Survey. There we have advertising towards the left-hand side of the chart, competing very strongly with more supposedly traditional elite disciplines like medicine and law, and we've got journalism and academia in there. And what they're really competing on is the extent to which they underrepresent working class people and people from intermediate origins in their workforce. So it's not us saying that marketing is an elite discipline, it's data that bears this out in a long-term study from the government's Office of National Statistics. So quickly, another reference point just to expand on this idea of the difference that there is in the cultural and economic and educational experience of marketers versus the mainstream audience that they're looking to influence. And again, this is another question about thinking back to when you were 14. And this time, we'd like to think about where you lived when you were 14 and think about how far in miles that place is from the town or city where you live now. Now again, we are looking at a question that's readily available in the UK and the Office of National Statistics website, and it's a question that features in a wide range of surveys that are done in the UK around ideas like local democracy, local citizenship, and exploring issues of local identity. And of course, what this question is effectively doing is it's trying to establish how geographically mobile the UK population is. And again, this is data, widely available and published data that's been used to great effect by authors in the UK over the last few years. And here we're referencing a very interesting book that was published by David Goodhart in the UK probably about 2 or 3 years ago. And this is really looking at things through the lens of Brexit, which has been the key issue concerning the media in the UK up until probably the COVID crisis that's just hit in the last few months. And what David Goodhart argues is that basically, as the cover of the book shows here, there are essentially two new tribes that are shaping British politics, the somewheres and the anywheres. And Goodhart uses this data from the ONS to show and define what a somewhere is, that tribe is. And the percentage, the large percentage on the right-hand side of the screen here, the 60%, is a piece of data that every time Andrew or I present it to an audience, we get widespread surprise at this data, because what it's showing is that 60% of adults in the UK still live within 20 miles of the place that they grew up as a child. So this idea that we're told a lot of the time, and we have a common sense understanding, certainly from the media and perhaps in marketing generally, that we have a geographically mobile workforce. But what this is showing is a significant majority of mainstream audiences don't move very far from the childhood home and have a very, very real connection to a specific locality and area. Now, I'd just like you to think and contrast that with the places where marketers tend to live and the places where the work tends to be done. And that tends to be large cosmopolitan cities with highly geographically mobile workforces. And if people are familiar with the largest cities, London, for example, it seems that most people that you know are all from somewhere else. So there's this idea that, again, thinking about the cultural experience of marketers and the people that work in marketing versus the cultural experience of the mainstream audience they're trying to influence, there's a significant difference in experience here. And it could be summed up as saying that in Goodhart's terms, marketers are anywheres as a tribe, and a significant part of the mainstream audience that we're trying to influence are somewheres. So essentially, we're taking two very broad takeouts from these questions. To be slightly provocative, you could argue that you don't have to be privileged to work in marketing, but it helps. And also that marketers are anywheres as opposed to the somewheres in the mainstream audience. And over the last few years, we've seen this play out in very, very straightforward ways in some of the data that we've collected. So again, through the lens of Brexit, every survey that we've done, we've asked people how they voted in the EU referendum in 2016. And we find incredibly marked differences between our marketing samples and our mainstream samples on that question. In 2018, we asked a media agency sample the question, and over 90% said they voted Remain. We broadened that out to a wider marketing sample in 2019, and we've asked the question again in the research that we're going to trail at the end of this presentation. And the figure for a wider marketing sample is still 75% in support of Remain. So these experiences translate into real differences in how marketers and the mainstream audience view the future of Britain. But the key question here is, we're here to talk about marketing, and we're presuming that a substantial part of the audience on this webinar are marketers or people that work in some associated field to marketing. So there are differences between marketers and the mainstream, but from a marketing perspective, in terms of the practice of marketing, does this matter? So our start point with gut instinct is that it certainly did matter. Referencing a whole range of behavioural science, there was a clear indication and a hypothesis that actually what would be happening because of these divergent experiences is that marketers would actually develop a cognitive style and a way of experiencing and interpreting the world that was actually significantly different from the mainstream audience. And a lot of this might happen at actually quite an unconscious level. So this statement here really sums up the key hypothesis that we took into the gut instinct work. It's that marketers don't think like the mainstream and they don't even realise it. So this is something that has been unconsciously projected onto their work based on the different experiences that they have. So what I'm going to do now is very briefly take you through some of the reference points and some of the data that we use to explore this hypothesis. Our key reference point here is the seminal work by Richard Nisbet that's been summarised in his book, The Geography of Thought. And it's really it's a compendium of 20 years of incredibly creative cross-cultural research. And Nisbet's real concern was looking at the difference in cultures between the West, people living in the UK, the US and Western Europe, and the East, people in China and Japan and over in those different parts of Asia. And what Nisbet's concluded from this wide range of work is that the culture in the West and the East can be described by two very divergent thinking styles. An analytical style that very much characterises a Western outlook. And as we're summarising here, we can describe this as seeing the world as a line. Other ways of thinking about this is that analytical thinkers in the West tend to see the world as very discrete and dichotomous. They tend to focus on categorisation, and they also have an overarching assumption that the world that they inhabit is inherently knowable and predictable. And Nisbet contrasts this with people who live in the East, who adopt, he argues, a much more holistic thinking style. And we've summarised that here as saying that holistic people see the world as a circle. And to put some more detail onto that, what we mean by that is they have a much more interdependent relationship with the world and the environment that they inhabit. They focus much more on context, on the gestalt of their environment, and actually on the interdependence of relationships between all of the factors that they're experiencing. And what this then means is for holistic thinkers, the world is actually much more complex and interrelated, and therefore inherently more uncertain and less knowable than analytical thinkers think it is. Now, the really interesting thing from our point of view is this is work that's been established for some time, but more recently, the work has been extended and the specific references are in the Gut Instinct white paper. This has been extended into using it to describe populations within a specific culture or nation. And what's been found is that the analytic and holistic thinking styles can be used to describe differences along class lines in a population. And broadly speaking, an analytical style can be seen to be more strongly associated with people with middle-class origins and social and economic experiences, whereas holistic thinking can be seen as something that's characterised more in a working-class population. And of course, given the remarks we've already made about the differences there is in the people who work in marketing versus the mainstream and the associations there is with that, with a certain class origin, this created a very, very interesting ground for us to explore in terms of our differences between marketers and the mainstream. And I'm just going to very briefly show you some data and show you some of the ways that we approached understanding whether this difference in thinking style was borne out in our marketing and mainstream samples. So here's hopefully quite a fun and quick question that will hopefully illustrate some of the points we're trying to make here. So think about this very quickly. What goes best with a monkey? Is it A, a panda, or B, a banana? Now, if you intuitively pair the monkey and the panda, this may indicate that you've got a tendency towards analytical thinking. And the reason for that is it's likely that what was salient in your decision to pair the monkey and the panda was this idea of categorization. What intuitively comes to your mind that helps you make this decision? Well, you think about categories and what's a salient category? A monkey and a panda are both in the category animal, and therefore you pair them together. And that would indicate that that categorization and therefore an analytical thinking style may be driving your interpretation of the question and your decision about how to pair it. Conversely, if you've paired the monkey with a banana, this might actually indicate a tendency towards more holistic thinking. And the reason for this is that perhaps what was salient in your decision was the relationship between the objects was more salient than the categorisation. And what's the relationship here? Well, there's a strong association for many people between monkeys and bananas because monkeys eat bananas. They don't qualify in the same category, but there's a very, very strong relationship there. And that might be what drives the thinking style for some people. So, look, a very, very fun and brief example, but for anyone who hasn't read our white paper, I want to assure you that we haven't based the whole of our thesis on a fun experiment with monkeys and pandas and bananas. What we actually did is a very extensive piece of research with a nationally representative sample of the UK population and a substantial sample of marketers, in this case represented by media agencies. And we conducted a wide range of behavioural experiments and psychological profiling that were designed to explore these differences in thinking style between marketers and the mainstream. And what you can see on this chart is that our hypothesis was borne out in a very significant fashion. Generally, across all of our experiments, we found a strong tendency for the mainstream audience to exhibit a much more holistic thinking style in making their decisions in the experiments that we asked them to complete. Media agency, representing marketers in this case, showed a much weaker tendency towards holistic thinking and also a stronger tendency towards the analytical thinking style in their decisions about how they approach the experiments. So here, in 2018, we had the emergence of a very, very key theme that, as Andrew referenced in his opening remarks, has only grown in salience in the marketing industry, certainly in the UK, and we're aware of traction for it in other markets like the US as well, which is this idea that marketers interpret the world and have a different thinking style from the mainstream audiences that they're trying to influence. And as Andrew was saying, this distinction between analytical and holistic thinking is something that has been adopted by Orlando Wood in his fantastic book Lemon. And what he did with it, he took these and he applied it to the IPA's effectiveness database and actually found a strong correlation between analytic thinking, or in his terms, left brain thinking, and a decline in effectiveness of advertising creative that has been consistent for the last 15 years. So in 2018, we've been in there right at the beginning of a very, very interesting theme that is getting to the stage that, frankly, marketers can't ignore about the consequences of the composition of marketing and how that affects the work that they create and how they engage with their audience. So before I hand over to Andrew, I'd just like to leave you with two other possibly more tangible and accessible charts that illustrate some of the challenges that marketers have because of their divergent experiences and composition. So this is the mainstream, the contrast of the values of the mainstream and marketers. And this is based again on very robust academic work. This is actually a framework that's used in the World Values Survey. And again, the full reference is in the Gut Instinct white paper. But you can see clearly here, the yellow bar is media agencies, and obviously they are pulling towards certain values much more strongly than the mainstream. And those happen to be values that focus on two key areas. One is openness to change, and that's values around stimulation and hedonism. And one is individualistic values around personal achievement and power. And in contrast, you have a mainstream audience that focus much more on values that might be regarded as qualifying as conserving values around tradition and conformity. Now, given all the remarks we've made already, this shouldn't seem so surprising. We've established that marketers have different cultural and economic experiences from the mainstream, and that's reflected in their values. However, one of the key findings we had in Gut Instinct was this. Now, one of the things that marketers are told from an early stage in their career, and it's continuously emphasised by thought leaders like Mark Ritson, is that it is not about being the same as your audience. Ritson continually uses the refrain in his pieces in Marketing Week that you are not the consumer. You don't have to be the same as the audience. But the whole thing that marketing is based on is the assumption that marketers are very good at interpreting and understanding the goals and motivation of their audience. So what we found when we asked a very reasonable question, which was asking marketers to predict the values of the mainstream, is that they're simply not very good at understanding the motivations and values of the people they're trying to influence. You can see very clearly here that they overemphasize the mainstream's focus on individualistic values like hedonism and power, and they wildly underplay the importance of collectivist values or values of self-transcendence like universal and benevolence to the mainstream audience. And so here really what we have is the kernel of the whole idea about the empathy delusion. You could look at this chart as an illustration of what Andrew's just about to talk about. The mainstream audience have very different values, and marketers aren't very good at putting themselves in the mainstream shoes. And so now I'll hand over to Andrew, who will take it from there and talk specifically about the empathy delusion.
Thanks, Ian. So I think one of the interesting things is on that gut instinct work, we actually challenged our industry to think and behave a bit differently. And the response that we were getting when we were going out and presenting it is the word empathy. So we're really good at it. We just kind of need to turn it up a notch. However, the science actually shows that building empathy is a really hard thing to do. It's not all about feelings and emotion. Actually putting yourself into the shoes of someone else requires quite deep self-awareness and considerable mental effort. And we as humans are what's known as cognitive misers. We're driven by emotion and intuition. And I think if everyone would agree that marketeers are only human, then the question was, did we really have the tools to walk the talk? And actually, when we think about what's happened prior to COVID in the last 4 or 5 years, we've obviously had two very big twin cultural shocks of Trump and Brexit. And whilst they were quite surprising, I think they gave a welcome dose of reality for people in our industry, because of course we've always operated in a bubble, but I think it made many people realize the extent to which we had lost touch with mainstream audiences. And I think many believe that the solution is actually to kind of get out there in the real world and spend time with ordinary people, so that things like Ogilvy's Get Out There scheme is a good example, where they announced that they'd be sending planners across the country to go into the streets and talk to real people. Going rogue was how they described it. And, you know, apart from it being a little bit patronizing, maybe well-intentioned, I think this approach makes the basic assumption that people working in our industry generally have high levels of empathy to begin with. So all we need to do is really kind of send our planners out on a safari to meet the weird and wonderful creatures beyond the M25, and they'll kind of do their thing. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. We think that maybe we hire people who are strong in empathy traits, or that we have a culture of empathy. But the question we really asked ourselves was this assumption correct? Do we really have a special aptitude for understanding others? So what we did is we measured people in our industry on the mainstream to understand their ability or understand other people's emotions and perspectives. And what happened is respondents were shown 14 statements from a trait empathy scale developed by academic psychologists, half related to what's called perspective taking, the other in terms of affective empathy, and they rated each statement on how well they felt it described them. And I guess there's a couple of interesting findings. One is that actually there aren't high levels of empathy in society to begin with, but the more interesting finding is the fact that people in advertising and marketing have no special aptitude for understanding others. We don't necessarily have this great gift. In fact, we're kind of more in line with mainstream audiences. And I think that's a concern, given that this underpins a lot of the work, a lot of what we do. Now, so to explore advertising and marketing's capacity for empathy, what we did is we turned to cutting edge moral psychology. So in the empathy delusion, we essentially asked people working in our industry to consider the deepest questions about their ethics, identity and morals. And we basically started with one key hypothesis, that was that people working in marketing and advertising have different moral foundations and unconscious intuitions about what is right and wrong. And actually our results confirm this. We'd argue that it shows that these moral differences create quite a substantial barrier to connecting with mainstream audiences. But it's not just about this lack of understanding and how it influences day-to-day decision making. We actually show that divergent beliefs about what is right and wrong actually causes us to discriminate based on some pretty culturally salient issues on our time. And actually our argument really is for us to build empathy by challenging our assumptions and learning to respect and acknowledge and recognize the ethics of mainstream audiences. Now, our starting point for exploring the morality and ethics of our industry was a fascinating and seminal book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. So Jonathan Haidt is a leading social psychologist. He's been at the forefront of popularizing the idea of weird morality and psychology. And by weird, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. And basically what Haidt does is he identifies 5 moral foundations and shows that although weird morality is dominant in political, cultural, media and professional elites in the US, weird people are actually statistical outliers whose moral foundations are unrepresentative of the general population. And these moral foundations fall in kind of 2 categories. The first is individualizing, very much focused on the welfare and the rights in the individual. And then the second group, which is binding. So you'll be familiar with terms like in-group loyalty. And we take out 2 very important principles from Haidt's moral foundation theory. The first is that morals are a set of social standards, which means they're socially functional. We all use morals to identify our in-groups and demonstrate our personal worth and ability to fulfill a useful role within those groups. And the second thing is that moral evaluations are actually driven by intuition and work at an unconscious level. So this quote from Haidt's book is essentially saying that we believe we are issuing executive orders while most of the time we're actually engaged in hastily constructing plausible post-rationalizations to explain decisions taken somewhere else for reasons that we don't really understand. And basically what Haidt did through extensive research is he proved that people who self-identify as conservatives in the US sense of the word regard all 5 moral foundations as more or less equally relevant to decision making. Liberals place much greater importance on the individualizing ethics, and they actually downplay the relevance and importance of the binding ethics of community. Now, what this turns out is it's a much bigger problem for liberals than it is for conservatives. So there's growing evidence that actually liberals find it harder to connect with people on the other end of the political spectrum. And there's lots of research which backs this up, but there's a similar pattern which has emerged here in the UK. So, for example, people who identify as Labour voters are less likely to say that they'd be happy if their child married a Tory voter than the other way around. And there's loads of other research which has found that, for instance, that Brexit voters are more likely to say they would happily have a friend as a Remainer than vice versa. And the reason being is this is a problem of in the sense that they find it more difficult to tolerate alternative points of view because they have narrower moral foundation. So this is a problem of perspective taking, is that they simply don't see the same relevance for other points of view based on community ethics. And actually we tested this amongst the UK mainstream population, and we found exactly the same pattern. The results mirror Haidt's exactly, but this time based on a left-right identity scale. So you can see that people on the left who identify as the left, downplay the binding ethics of community. And this got us thinking about the advertising industry, because of course we know the advertising industries is an elitist industry. It's slightly more likely to say that they lean left. So we actually measured people working in the industry against the same framework that Haidt developed. And we can see on the individualizing ethics that actually we are exactly the same as the mainstream. We place equal importance on those. But when it comes to the binding ethics of community, we downplay the relevance. And we can, our argument is that our industry are using different ethical and cultural settings to large swathes of the population, which underpins quite a profound impact and a profound disconnect with people it seeks to influence. And it's actually really important to point out that these differences are not simply a function of our industry's political identity or ideological preferences, because our data shows that people at both ends of the spectrum in the advertising and marketing industry actually have more polarized moral preferences compared to, so a right-leaning marketeer is more likely to downplay the relevance of the binding ethics than a right-leaning mainstream, and the same on the left as well. So you might think, well, does this really matter? You know, does it really impact how we engage with people who maybe have different moral foundations to ourselves? And actually, we decided to test this using the biggest issue of the time, which was back in July, which was Brexit, and one of the most famous experiments from behavioral economics. So the dictator game is a simplified version of the ultimatum game, first proposed by famous behavioral scientists Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler. And in our version of the dictator game, respondents are asked to imagine they were paired with someone else, an anonymous partner, and they're given £50 to share as little or as much with the other person that they're playing with. And on the plus side, in the real world, people really do prefer fairness. So 77% of mainstream audiences would share equally with the person that they've been paired with. People in advertising and marketing, significantly less likely to share equally, but on the good side, it's still almost 7 in 10. What's interesting is there is rich academic literature which has used the dictator game to explore political polarization and the impact of identity on people's social preferences. So in a nutshell, there is strong evidence to suggest that people depart from this fairness default when they're asked to play a game with someone who has a different identity or perceived set of beliefs or values. So what we did is we actually brought in 2 further rounds of this game. Given that the advertising marketing industry, as Ian mentioned, are mainly Remain voters, the second variable we brought in is we then told people in marketing and advertising that they were playing this game with a fellow Remainer. And then the third part of the game, we then told Remain marketeers that they were playing with someone who voted Leave in the EU referendum, and asked them how much, whether they would be, how many would be willing to share equally. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we know our identity neutral benchmark is at 69% of us sharing equally. When it comes to sharing equally with a Remain voter, that number increases to 82%. That's what social scientists called in-group love. But what happens when a Remain marketeer is told that they are then playing with someone who voted Leave in the EU referendum? Well, we see this number, we see this dramatic impact on willingness to share. Just 43% of Remain marketeers are willing to share 50-50 with a Leaver. And this actually is we see a similar polarizing impact with amongst mainstream audiences, but I think this departure from the fairness norm is a clear sign of a tendency to punish or discriminate against those who hold opposing beliefs. And the drop is actually stronger than in the mainstream sample. And I think what's interesting on this is, you know, we ask ourselves, well, is this really surprising? Because after all, we are only human. So we would expect that people in our industry are strongly influenced by intuitions and herd behavior. But remember, there is a persistent belief in our industry that we have a stronger empathy, or that we are trained to overcome our biases. But it turns out that we're actually slightly more likely to be driven by these biases than the mainstream. And I think there is no evidence for greater empathy or capacity for perspective taking when it comes to what was the biggest social, political and cultural issue of the day. So what does this mean? What are our kind of recommendations? What can we take out from this? So, I mean, how do we communicate that we get it and that our brands are relevant to mainstream lives? And I think for the most part, we tend to be seduced by the direct approach. So we strive to identify a relevant message. We build a campaign to tell people why it matters and why it should matter to them. Me and Ian are big fans of the economist John Kay, who's a kind of exponent of an alternative approach. In his book Obliquity, he explains why our goals are best achieved indirectly. And there's loads of evidence throughout history of obliquity. So for instance, the happiest people are not always the people that wake up every day and say they're going to be the most happiest. So maybe consider this, that perhaps the most relevant brands aren't those brands that are banging on about how relevant they are the whole time. So there's a wealth of evidence, including our own recent work on how different media channels foster a sense of community, and shows that the environment and context in which people interact with brands is absolutely critical. So as I mentioned, people are cognitive misers. Most people don't spend and waste precious cognitive resource worrying about what a brand thinks or believes, but people do unconsciously incorporate brands into themselves. So brands can build relevant identification and shared values implicitly by being associated with the things and being found in the places that people do care about. So over reliance on explicit messaging, narrow targeting, and direct strategies like brand purpose are likely to be inefficient because they just exclude too many people. So our argument really is that a broadly targeted and diverse mass media strategy offers a powerful indirect way of building a truly plural brand with broad cultural relevance. So we've built, I guess, an argument for pluralist advertising using the framework by Haidt. But the question is, can it really help us grow our brands? And I think we can consider some of the parallels between Haidt and probably the most famous marketing book of recent years, which is of course How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp. And Sharp shows that brands grow by maximizing relevant associations and building mental availability. And actually, in marketing terms, Haidt's application of moral foundation theory to political communication is basically an argument for maximizing moral availability. And I think it shows the importance to brands of maximizing ethical entry points across both individualizing and binding morality. Because actually, if you think about, we're living in what many call a culture war and polarization, it's not clear that unconsciously projecting our moral intuitions onto others or consciously taking sides is actually good marketing, because these are narrowly targeted strategies. And things like established media offers an oblique route to maximizing moral availability, because we know that media types have spent decades and actually in some cases hundreds of years of building strong identities based on shared values and ethics. And brands can maximize their ethical entry points and mainstream relevance by maximizing coverage across diverse and trusted media. So Ian talked about a lot about kind of individualism and holistic versus analytical, and we wanted to take that a bit further because we really feel that the industry's fixation with individualism and standing out actually misses the mark. So we adapted an experiment from an excellent paper called Choice as an Act of Meaning. It's very simple. We asked our mainstream samples to imagine two scenarios where they bought the same shoes or they bought the same cars as a friend. And overwhelmingly, people feel really good about owning things that their friends had. And you think about these industries are routinely marketing using individualistic messages and increasing levels of personalization. But actually the underlying assumption that people's product choices are motivated by a need to stand out and signal their unique personality and indirectly is actually not really the case. In fact, owning the same stuff as other people makes them feel good. It makes them feel special being the same rather than being unique. And our exploration of moral foundations and people's attitudes to choice emphasizes the importance the mainstream place on these binding ethics and social proof. And this is a belief for us that it reinforces our point that highly atomized strategies based on hyper targeting and personalization really do fail to leverage very powerful drivers of behavior. So obviously we know there's a big marketing trend at the moment, maybe even more so since COVID, commonly referred to as brand purpose. We label it as social virtue marketing strategies because of course every brand should have a purpose. And actually in previous generations, I think we'd seek to signal our social standing by wearing the latest Nikes or driving a BMW. But I don't think that's good enough for people like us. I think cultural capital is where it's at these days. So the author Elizabeth Currid-Halkett sums it up best when she writes about the aspirational class, which I believe we're all a part of, who seek to signal their social position via shared knowledge and values. And what better way to virtue signal than to project our own values onto the work that we produce and the products we buy? So plain toothpaste isn't enough. It now needs an added dash of saving the world. And I think we shouldn't forget that we're still an elite subset of the population. Most of the mainstream remain motivated by materialism. So I think if we're being honest with ourselves, social virtue marketing strategies are not necessarily grounded in the needs of the mainstream. It's actually based on the needs and the assumptions of people working in our industry. And even if we insist our brands go down that route, I think we just need more scrutiny of what social virtue actually is and what it means to people, because it's of little use if it just kind of widens the gap between us and the people that we're trying to influence. A final point really is that empathy is much harder than we think. We need to dispense with the complacent exceptionalism that has our industry assuming that we're naturally good at empathy. We're only human, many forces get in our way, confirmation bias is strong, and morality is socially functional. As people working in marketing and advertising, our moral intuitions are bound up with group belonging. So psychologically, it's very difficult to associate ourselves with any message or media that challenges our identity. But as Daniel Kahneman says, to build empathy, we need to slow down. Perspective taking is absolutely crucial to identifying relevant common strategies and messages, and the value of placing kind of brands in divergent media contexts and environment. And I suppose we don't need to feel the same as the mainstream or believe the same as the mainstream, but we do need the courage to understand and connect more deeply with them. So what Ian and I just wanted to finish off on was really this idea and this narrative going around in the industry at the moment that as a result of COVID, that everything has changed. Things are never going to be the same again. And Ian and I are very much of the opinion that yes, of course, the context changes and there will be some changes, but actually the underlying motivations and drivers of people remains the same regardless. So all we've simply done is in the last week of April, when COVID was kind of at its peak in the UK, or the first peak, we went back and we retested with a marketing sample and a mainstream sample some of the frameworks that we've taken you through today. And actually I won't spend a long time on this, but just to show you that actually COVID hasn't rewired us. If you look at the modern mainstream from 2 years ago to now, actually our value systems have remained remarkably similar. Now, one of the things that's being questioned is, okay, well, has COVID caused a sea change, which is making people in our industry much more empathetic towards mainstream audiences? Unfortunately, we're not really seeing that that's the case. There are no signs that the empathy gap is closing. Just research very recently shows that sorry, it's slightly labeled wrong there, but marketing people's the orange line there is that marketing people, their estimation of mainstream values is really still quite far off. We're still overemphasizing people's hedonism, achievement and power, and understanding their universalism, self-direction and benevolence. Are we suddenly much closer together on the binding ethics of community? No, the pattern is still the same. We are still using very different ethical and cultural settings to the mainstream. This again is from April 2020. And one of the questions as well that gets talked about is, does the Brexit identity even exist? Are we still impacted by the biases? This is the latest data, which clearly shows that there is still a Brexit identity out there. It's still underlying, and we still discriminate against those who have different kind of beliefs and values to ourselves. So what I wanted to finally finish off on is a lot of people have been asking us when our kind of follow-up to Empathy Delusion is coming out, and I'm pleased to say that we will be publishing a new study in June, and we've got some exciting a kind of launch which will give more details soon. I just wanted to touch briefly on what it's called and what we're focusing on. The study is going to be called the Aspiration Window. We are going to be looking at the difference in aspiration between mainstream audiences and people in our industry, and do we really understand mainstream aspiration? And we'll be honest, we had this study almost ready to go before COVID happened, but we decided as a consequence that we would redo the field work and to see if there were any interesting impacts on aspiration pre-COVID to the COVID kind of society that we're in at the moment. So we're very excited to be publishing that next month. Just to finish as well, we publish lots of research in this space, so we're just talking about our two main studies today, but if you want to go down and read, go and download the white papers, they're available on the Reach Solutions website. They go into much more detail than Ian and I were able to go in today, and you'll also find other interesting research studies around these subjects. Ian, is there anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. Just interested to see if we'll get any time for questions.
Yeah, I think we've got a bit of time, 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? They can type them into the question box. So we've got a question about the research methods followed. I don't know, Ian, if you want to discuss a bit more about how we came, some of the frameworks and where we got them from.
Sorry, which question is that? Sorry, Andrew.
I'm just seeing a question about the research methods we followed and how we came to those.
Basically, as I said briefly at the beginning in the introduction, House 51 bases its whole approach on deciding that rather than reinvent the wheel, there's a lot of incredibly good scholarship out there on a wide range of issues that are relevant to marketers. And so we're very much grounded and plugged into academic research as well. And these are a range of, some of these frameworks are ones that I come across in my academic work. Recently completed some postgraduate work in behavioural economics in London and continue to collaborate with a range of academics at City University. So these are all things that we're aware of, and as we go around our day-to-day lives thinking about marketing problems, that Andrew and I kind of basically converged on a range of these frameworks that we thought articulated some of the day-to-day issues that we've both experienced in our careers in marketing. So that it's an eclectic range of things that are taken from the worlds of cross-cultural psychology, behavioural economics and psychology more broadly. And as Andrew's emphasised in his piece, the basic principle is that marketers are people too, but as behavioural economics and behavioural science has become more in vogue in marketing, we focused on using it to explain the behaviour of others. And we believe that the powerful thing to do is to turn that behavioural lens on ourselves to help us do better work. So yeah, I can supply more detailed references for any of the stuff we've talked about if you want them.
Yeah, I thought I had a good question here about, have you done any analysis on who within agencies is more or less similar versus the mainstream? And actually we do have data on that from the Empathy Delusion study. So what we found is that creatives and strategy stroke planning stroke researchers are the most extreme on the moral foundations. So they're the least like mainstream audiences, which is quite interesting given that a lot of what certainly creatives do is based on intuition, and you could say, okay, well, the planners or the strategists are there to kind of potentially rein creatives in, but they're the second most extreme. We find that I think if I'm speaking correctly, it's more the kind of accounts management that tended to be more in line with mainstream audiences, but there are still big differences.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the spectrum. I mean, interestingly, from our own discipline, the people that are supposedly closest to the data, i.e. planners and market researchers, come out of it quite badly. So the data isn't making as much impact on their work as it should do.
Yeah, and one of the questions was, are the secondary resources referenced in the white paper? Absolutely, they're all listed in there. Will we be doing a follow-up webinar for the aspiration window? Yeah, we absolutely will. There's an interesting where some of the differences of the marketing stroke agency versus mainstream are partly explained by differences in age, particularly around hedonism and individualism. Actually, when you look at the values, of course, yes, age plays a part, but even when you look at 16 to 34-year-olds, for instance, mainstream 16 to 34-year-olds versus 16 to 34-year-olds in agencies, there are quite big differences on those values. And actually, when it comes to the kind of marketing, the marketing industry and the empathy delusion, the profile of the industry was, the profile of the marketing industry was not as young as media agencies. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Ian.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and just for the sake of brevity, we haven't included all of that analysis in the white paper, but we control for all of those variables, and actually one of the most powerful findings is that age is a factor, as Andrew says. It's the same when we look at political identity as well, left versus right. Anything you look at, when you control for those factors, marketers still come out different from the general cohort. So a left-wing marketer is different from a left-wing mainstream, and a right-wing marketer is different from a right-wing mainstream. A young marketer is different from a young mainstream. This goes across the board, and it's something we're thinking about summarising as an additional piece of analysis to make this point clear, that there is something about the culture of marketing over and above the demographics of it as well.
Yeah, and just to add, because there's been a question, just to clarify, the first gut instinct study we did with people working in media agencies, but actually the empathy delusion was done with a mix of marketeers and people that work in the advertising industry in both media agencies and creative agencies. So one of the questions was, do we think kind of in-house marketeers would be similar? But actually, the sample consisted of in-house marketeers in the empathy delusion. I'm just trying to see if there's got time for one more question. I don't know if Ian, you're looking at the questions as well. Oh, this is a good one. So
well, there's a good one. Oh, you beat me to that. There was a good one there. Can I go?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. So do you think that conservative values will increase as a result of COVID-19? Well, this is one of the things that we're going to talk about more in our next study, is that it's natural that there's going to be, people don't like uncertainty, and marketers are no different. So we're looking for these predictions about what's going to happen. But as Andrew was saying at the end of our study, the reason we went back and retested the frameworks that we did is we have this overarching hypothesis is that the marketing industry is hothousing the changes that COVID is going to, it's not that we're going to be rewired, or human nature is going to be rewired by this crisis. The environment has certainly changed. We're all leading very different lives, but it's something that people aren't really necessarily that plastic that things change, even in a massive crisis like this, over the short term. And so therefore we are going to do other waves of research as the crisis goes on to see if these basic frameworks we've looked at are going to change again as it goes on. So it's one of these very interesting questions we've got. If I'm going to stick my neck out right now, my feeling is, depending on how long the crisis goes on, we won't see a fundamental rewiring of people's values as a result of the crisis, but their behaviour will change because the context in which they behave has changed substantially by the crisis.
Brilliant. Ian, thank you very much. Everyone, thanks so much for joining today. If you need to get in contact with us, download the white papers. Our Twitter handles are there if you want to send us a message. And I hope everyone stays safe, and hopefully we can all see each other in person very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.